to Moms for America Cottage Meeting, virtual meeting, lesson number 5 in a series of 12 lessons. So good to be with you today. My name is Julie Jackson, actually the National Vice President over Cottage Meetings for Moms for America. I've been involved with this organization for about 9 years. The whole premise is that liberty begins at home. And the best way that mamas can understand the great principles and the stories and miracles of America is to learn them first ourselves. And the best way moms learn is by coming together with other moms. And we share our experiences and we teach and we learn from one another. And that is what a cottage meeting is. And so because of the pandemic, we're coming live to you via the airwaves virtually. And we are on lesson number 5 today. Before we begin our cottage meeting, we always ask, we always have a little prayer and say a pledge to ask God that the Spirit will be with us in our discussions today. And as we learn, that we'll learn the things that will be most valuable to our children and our grandchildren, the people that we love. So we've asked Vivian from Texas. We've got Vivian today, and we've got Jessica from New York, and we're missing Kimberly, who's on travel today, and Kelly. But we're going to do just great today. So if Vivian, if you'll offer a little prayer, and then we will pledge.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the wisdom that you offer our leaders and us. We're so grateful for your divine intervention, and we hope that you'll continue to bless America. We pray in your name. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much, Vivian. My mama always taught me that the prayers of a mother shoot straight to the top, and I felt that as you pray today on the behalf of this nation. God doesn't mess with the mother's prayers. I firmly believe that. So thank you, Vivian. Well, like I said, Jessica from New York is with us. Vivian from Texas. I live in the Washington, D.C. area. Normally, Kimberly from Nebraska and Kelly from Ohio are normally with us. But thank you so much for all the moms that are watching via the webinar out there. I hope that you're getting inspired as you're watching these lessons each week. And the Spirit is pricking upon your heart about how you might begin to form a cottage meeting in your neighborhood amongst like-minded mothers and grandmothers and friends that you have. You know, it's something that I did 12 years ago in the neighborhood I lived in Oregon. I think it was 5 moms. We were worried about what our children were being taught in school. And so we began to meet once a month for 2 hours, and we started reading. Our first book was The 5,000-Year Leap. And from there, we were off to the races. And so I have a real firm conviction of the power of cottage meeting. And I've seen firsthand how it changed my life, how it changed the homes and the lives of the women that attended that cottage meeting. And so we're so glad to have you with us. Okay, so we're on the 5th lesson today of the 12 lesson series from the Cottage Meeting Manual book. Here's the manual that we use each week. You can buy it on Amazon or get it from the momsforamerica.us website, the mom's store there. And I think it's $18. We have gone through lesson 1 through 4. The first lesson was anchored in hope. How do we stay anchored in hope in a world, especially in the world today, where we look to God? We make our family time a high priority. We study our founding documents, particularly the Constitution, these principles and liberties that our founders gave us from original sources. And we look to virtuous and moral leadership. And if we're not real happy with the leaders around us, then we get involved. We get involved with the campaigns. We contribute money. We start an organization. We start a cottage meeting. We join a cottage meeting. We run for office. And our second lesson was no place like home. That's where liberty begins. That's where we can best teach within the 4 walls of our homes. Moms will hands down be the best teachers that your children will ever have. The third lesson was ladies first. For as the women go, so goes the nation. So women, as we get educated, we will educate our our spheres of influence, our children, our extended family, our communities, our neighborhoods. Last week, we talked about the foundation of faith. This is the first pillar of liberty, is faith, how all of our founders believed that there was a supreme being, and there was divine laws that he set forth, this kind of order that the creator set forth for the universe, and that he gave us these inalienable rights, and to protect these rights, God revealed certain principles of divine law as contained in the Bible. The founders believed that. This was the foundation upon which they formed this nation. And today we're going to talk about the fifth lesson, the valor of virtue. Okay, so that's the second of the three principles of liberty. First is faith, second is virtue, and the third is patriotism, which we will talk about next week. So let's just turn to page 93 in our Cottage Manual Resource Guide. Wonderful resource. It's got all kinds of quotes, stories, video links, scripture. It's one of the greatest all-inclusive resources to teach liberty in one book. So I'm a real fan of this Cottage Meeting Manual. So the valor of virtue. So Vivian, if we could have that first slide there.
You bet. And Julie, we have a couple of moms joining us today. Looks like we have Tiffany and Bethany.
Welcome, Tiffany and Bethany. So glad to have you. Great. Maybe at the end you can pipe in and let us know where you're from. We're delighted to have you. Okay, so the valor of virtue, lesson number 5 in our Cottage Meeting resource. And if we could go to the next slide. And can I just say, Brielle, Vivian's 13-year-old daughter, did the PowerPoint. I am so impressed. It is a work of art, this PowerPoint, Brielle. Thank you so much, sweetheart. So I love this beginning quote at the very top of the page on 93 by Mary Lyons. Mary Lyon was an American pioneer in women education in the 1830s, 1840s. She was the first president of Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. It was a woman's female seminary, and it still is around today, all women's college in Massachusetts. But this is what Mary Lyons said: "Educate the woman and the man will be educated. Let the ladies understand the great doctrine of seeking the greatest good, of loving their neighbors as themselves. Let them indoctrinate their children in this fundamental truth, and we shall have wise legislators." So the purpose today of our lesson is to talk about the second pillar of liberty, virtue, and why a virtuous citizenry is vital to sustaining liberty. And we're also going to talk about this concept of public virtue, of doing good for the greater whole. And we're going to kind of dig into the first 3 principles of the 5,000-year leap. And can I just tell you, girls, those first 3 principles, I refer to those all the time when I'm having discussions of the day, of issues. And if you can pull out a principle, it diffuses arguments that are based just on sheer emotion. And we're seeing just a lot of emotion-based arguments today. And so if I could just show you, so you know this 5,000-year leap book is the 28 principles that our founders used to form this country. I have these principles memorized, and the best way to memorize these principles is this little bookmark that the National Center for Constitutional Studies sells. You can, for $5, you can get 100 of these bookmarks. So I have them in every book. They're in my car, they're up on my nightstand, and it helped me to memorize these 28 principles, because on the back of the bookmark is the 28 principles. $5 for 100 at nccs.net. I think it's the best resource. You can give them out like pieces of candy. These are powerful tools to write these principles on your heart. And I review these principles every couple of days. I memorize. And a part of retaining what you memorize is to review it. So every couple of days, I'll zip through. I memorize this little opening paragraph here, what these principles are. And then on the back are the 28 principles. You will be so well armed. You will know 99% more about the the way the government should work, how the founders intended it to work by memorizing these 28 principles than the average citizen that you'll come up against. They are powerful. And so I'd really recommend you getting this book, the $5, 100 bookmarks, and then just putting them in every book you want. Okay, so let's flip the page on over to 94 and 95. One of the best ways to teach virtue is through stories to your children and to your grandchildren. And so we have several presentation resources listed here on page 94 and 95 of books to teach this principle of virtue. The Alliance by Gerald Lunn, the Chronicles of Narnia. There's a book on leadership and self-deception that's recommended here about a man facing challenges on the job and in his family and how he dealt with that. Then at the top of page 95, The Whipping Boy. It's a great book for kids. It sparks all kind of good conversation. And then Animal Farm. These are classics that we read in high school. Bonds That Make Us Free, talking about how we get trapped negative emotions in us. I have a girlfriend who swears by this book. And then if you turn the page to 96, The Anatomy of Peace. Now these books are all at least 7 years old because this is when this manual came out. So there will be more current recent books that have come on the market in the last 7 years. I find oftentimes I have 5 children, 25, 22, 20, 17, 12. I can't always get them to read one of my recommended books, but if I send them a YouTube, a real good inspirational story or speech or something like that, they'll listen to that. So I just listened a few days ago to Brene Brown. She's from the University of Texas. Vivian, are you familiar with Brene Brown? No. She's a national best-selling author. She was a researcher on, how you can be successful and happy and kind of overcome some of these issues that kind of keep us down. Anyways, Brene Brown, all the young people really like her as well. She really resonates as a professor at the University of Texas with young people. So she just gave the University of Texas commencement speech. And of course, it had to be virtually in her home because there are no graduations online at this point. And so it's a 21-minute speech that she gives, this commencement speech to the University of Texas graduates, talking about how she had to overcome all kind of adversity to get to where she is now. And it's fascinating because so many young people today think that they're entitled to success early. They don't want to work for it, And they think that, the job promotions should come quickly and things should just naturally fall into place. And so it's just a really good reminder that even, the known famous Brene Brown, when she was 20, 21, 22, 23, really had to work and a lot of things didn't go her way. So I sent that to my kids, and out of 5, one of them responded and said, "Mom, that was so good." So I consider that a success when I can get 1 out of 5 kids to respond to something that I sent. Is there anything that anyone has read, a really good book, that you would recommend to your children or that you'd recommend to us that you have come across lately that would be helpful in teaching me these principles of virtue and integrity?
No, but I've been collecting my books from the past few weeks from our stories, from our resources and things like that. So
Look at that.
Ben Franklin's The Book of Virtues.
So good.
The autobiography. So a bunch of them. And I bought the, I don't see it here, the From Slavery from, was that Booker T?
Oh.
Or was that Frederick Douglass? I can't remember.
I think that's Booker T. Yeah.
But the print is like 8 font. And I'm like, I'm old. I can't, who can read that size? So if you can read small font, it's the book for you.
So I saw the real Benjamin Franklin there that you held it to. All those books that you held up are so good. That is so good to read to your children. It's really easily understandable. And it kind of debunks a lot of the moral falsehoods about Benjamin Franklin. So anyways, very good. So one of the things that we focus on in this presentation several times is the importance of reading good books to your children, or even if you just read little snippets, just a little quote, or just send them a little YouTube story or something. One of the nice things about reading to your children, though, or having a discussion with them, you don't even read to them, but having discussion is the time that you spend together, sharing and that back and forth. So 3 of my 5 kids have left the home, flown the coop. So once a week, we have a Zoom conference call where we do a little scripture study and we talk about the events of the day. But it's very powerful to have mother teaching child and child teaching mother, you know, which is important for them to share their feelings. And so that opportunity to, you know, not just to recommend it, not ever discuss it, but the opportunity to be able to discuss it back and forth. So therefore reading or sharing and then coming together and talking about what you've read is a real powerful teaching tool. So in the book that Kimberly wrote, Women, America's Last Best Hope, in the back of this book, she has a Patriots reading list of books for adults, teenagers, and children. And it's on page 244. And it's really invaluable because sometimes I think moms are like, I don't know where to begin. What book should we start with? So in this book is the Patriots reading list. I mean, it looks over 100 books. Also in this, there you go, there it is on page 244, Women. Also in this book on page 29 through 32 is a list of 12, 24, 36, and 48 in that order recommended books to read to your children or to recommend to your children. And so if you just look in our Cottage Meeting Manual, we have you know, and every week we have resources that we recommend. But on page 30 or 29 of the Cottage Meeting Manual is also a list of classic reading books that we recommend. It's a list of 12, a list of 24, 36, and then 48. Okay, so let's just hop right into our lesson today on page 97 in the middle of the lesson. According to Cicero, a model society needs to be built, he said, on natural law. Very good. So natural law is considered God's law. Now, Cicero lived 43 years before Christ was born. He was a leading lawyer in Rome from 106 BC to 43 BC. But even he, you know, a great intellectual mind, philosopher, knew as he looked around that there had to have been a supreme divine creator. Nothing cannot create a something. We talked about that last week. And so how do you define natural law? If you turn to the very first principle in the 5,000-year leap, the very first principle says, the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations is natural law. And our founders got this concept from Cicero, in which they quote Cicero in their writings. They actually use his name, Cicero. They get their ideas from Cicero. And Cicero said natural law is God's law. And it says this in the first principle. It's the creator's order of things. It's true law. And the founders considered like the 10 Commandments to be something, God's law, true law. And so Cicero says, he suggests, how do we teach virtue to our members of society? Well, Cicero said, you teach them natural law in chapter 1 of principle 1, teach them about God's law, and then you weigh every law against that God's law. So it would be like today, every piece of legislation we weigh against what God's law is. And our founders knew that God gave us inalienable rights. These are God-given rights he gave us from the heavens. And to protect those rights, Principle 9 says he revealed certain divine law. And divine law is found in the Bible. So imagine today, Cicero, back in 106 BC, died at 43 BC, said, teach people, natural law, and then weigh every existing law against natural law. And that's how you will teach them virtue in society. Isn't that amazing? So how does that look to you? All right. How do you go about teaching God's law to your children and then weighing the balance of the laws that we have today? Do you have any discussion with your children, root the laws of today into God's law as contained in the Bible? How would that look to you? Are you doing anything right now to weigh the existing laws of today against the Bible?
I mean, I talk to my kids about it. Again, they're younger, but and usually it's issues that are difficult issues, I guess I would say. In January of last year in New York, they passed the bill for basically infanticide, so abortion up to the point of birth. And having my kids, being as young as they are, I did talk to them about it and how that was a very clear example of where law in this state was very different from God's law, and how every life is precious. Now, their aunt, my brother's wife, they're expecting their second child. So I explained to them, it's, you see the baby in Aunt Lori's belly. In our state, anyone can choose to get rid of that baby at any point. And, explain to them like the 10 Commandments and how every life is precious to the Lord, and he has a plan and a purpose for each one. And as difficult as it is, or for example, even with Pride Month, one of the things I see a lot in their commercials and in the cartoons they watch, those commercials that talk about it, really try to normalize it. They ask questions about it, and I tell them, what it is, and how in our country that they say it's okay for, a man and a man to get married, or a woman and a woman to get married. But in God's laws, that he wants a man and a wife, and that's how he created it. And just explaining to them that is, when we follow God's law, that's the best life that we can live. When we go away from his law and maybe follow the laws of the land, we are free to do that by the laws that the land have made. But is that our best life that God has for us? And just, kind of showing them the difference that way.
Jessica, that is exactly how we do it, mothers. The conversations that we have about current events, we pull in God's law. And it immediately helps to clarify confusion with the young people, because we know that the news and social media is so convincing. But if you have them weigh that against God's law, they begin to see more clearly and discern right from wrong. So for years, a part of my little morning devotion with my kids, I would hold up a newspaper and I would just read the headlines of the newspaper. And I tried to teach them little principles of the Constitution. And oftentimes I'd read the headlines and I'd go, is that consistent with what we just studied in Article 1 of the Constitution? But I think another weighing measure is the Constitution. And if you don't feel like you know the Constitution well enough, and really, I learned it with my kids. I was not a constitutional scholar. So I taught the Constitution along with my kids. But the best way, I believe, is to weigh it against God's law. So you read the headline. So like a few days ago, the law in Louisiana to restrict how abortion clinics can operate. I read that headline, and then we talk about how it will be easier now for doctors to be able to perform abortions based on the law that the Supreme Court struck down. And just like you, Jessica, what does the 10 Commandments say? It says, first of all, thou shalt not kill. So you can see that this this is law that has not been based on God's law. How can we be entitled to the blessings of God if we don't follow his created order of things? And so it gives them some foundational anchoring, because you're right. The news, the media, their peers, everything they're getting is almost contrary to God's law. And so if mom can help root those kids in discerning truth from error through God's law, that child will be anchored and strong when the winds are blowing and they're being told what really is acceptable and normal and okay today. So anyway, Cicero, he knew this in 106 BC, and it's a truth that still exists today. Something as simple as weighing all the existing laws that are being put forth by natural law. Natural law is just another word for God's law. And in the Declaration of Independence, they refer to natural law, I believe it's 5 times. Okay, so let's move on down to why is virtue. Oh, and I love that scripture reference that they give us in 97, Isaiah 5:20, that talks about born to them that will take light for dark and day for night and good for evil and bitter for sweet. And I think Isaiah is saying, look, it's going to be confusing. Some people will, you look up and say the sky is blue, but they'll say it's red, and you'll get confused, and they'll make something that is inherently so evil and wrong look so normal and right and beautiful. And so, we're going to be confused in life. And this is a tactic of Satan, obviously, to get us to, think evil is good, to think what really is truth is untruth and vice versa. And we see that coined today as fake news. It's hard to know what is truth, what is real. And so anyways, the question is asked, why is virtue an essential pillar in the founders' freedom formula? So let's turn to a supplemental resource, The Heart of Education, page 99. It's actually just the next page. I like this. Kimberly, who's the president of Moms for America, who's on travel today, is normally with us, wrote this article, and I really like it because she talks about, there's such an emphasis on educating the minds of our youth and reforming and improving education and giving more money to our education, but we're neglecting the heart. It is our hearts that guide our actions, not our brains. So if all we focus on is the brain, the result is a nation of highly intelligent people with no moral foundation. And that is a very dangerous thing. So on page 99, she quotes this study from the best-selling classic, The Closing of the American Mind, where they talk about the last society to be as highly trained and as poorly educated as the current US was Germany in 1930, where there were highly trained engineers who built these cutting edge submarines and missiles and airplanes, but they were not well read enough in history to vote against Hitler or to refuse to do his bidding. It was these same German scientists who understood chemicals and genetics, but not enough of ethics and morals and history or psychology or basic politics to not elect Hitler or refuse to torture their countrymen. It's when the time the submarines are being launched and the people are being tortured, it's too late at that point to do anything. In this article, it says, but only the combination of top technical training and poor leadership education could have allowed this to happen. A less highly trained people could not have done it, and a truly educated people would not have done it. This may seem extreme to some, but seriously, what is education all about? If it is not to teach us what is good, ideal, and right, then it isn't really education. So as we look around the world today and we see this moral decay in our society and all these riots and looting and violence erupting, I love that J.K. Rowling, she's one of the young people's contemporaries, our Harry Potter author, We could have that slide, Vivian. J.K. Rowling says, it is our choices that show who we really are far more than our abilities. I like that. It's our choices. It's not our brain. To educate, look by Theodore Roosevelt at the bottom there, to educate a person in the mind but not in morals is to educate a menace to society. I like that so much. What do you think about this in relation to what we're seeing with young people nowadays thinking revolution and tearing down the statues is the answer? I'll let you go, but I work a lot with young millennials. My husband and I, in our church group, we oversee about a congregation of about 200 young millennials, 18 to 30. And I love them, and they're beautiful, and they're seeking God. But even they have a tendency to think that they are very wise because they listen to a lot of podcasts, have access to a lot of information on their phone, social media. And I call this, they think they are wise because they therefore listen to podcasts. And so what are you seeing? Are you seeing this tendency in society today with our young people?
Yes, they're drinking the college Kool-Aid. I mean, they are. We talked about it last week, and I'm like, do I even want my daughter to go to college? I don't think they're teaching any of the things that I want her to learn. You know, she wants to be a scientist, and so she's going to have to go. But, you know, it's going to have to start at home. We have to give our kids a strong foundation at home. So when we send them off to college, they're going to be okay. And it's okay for them to be exposed to differences of opinions. But we as moms, we have to make sure that we firmly rooted them in these principles, so they're going to find their way back. You know, I talked about my friend last week, her son, who's definitely drank the Kool-Aid. And, you know, he's going to come back around because I know his mom and his family and their heart, and they've rooted him in that. But right now, you know, he's like 22, 23, so he's out there finding his way. He's, you know, like you said, he listens to the podcast, and he has a very opinionated idea of the world that he's learned in college. And with experience as he gets, you know, he'll come back around and he'll be okay. You know, what's the saying that we're all Democrats when we're young, and then as we get older, we all become Republicans, you know, because you're liberal and then you become more conservative as you get that experience. But I think we have to take back our universities. I heard somebody talking yesterday, you know, if you're Turning Point USA, the guy from Turning Point USA, he's like, look, all these conservative money people are giving, you know, just millions and billions of dollars to these liberal colleges and universities. And they're like, you know, he's encouraging them to stop. He's like, if you have these conservative principles, why are you funding places that don't allow conservative views? Why are you doing that? So I think Turning Point USA is out there trying to remind people, put your money where your mouth is. Put your money in the colleges that are going to have the same values as you to teach our children. I love that quote on Theodore Roosevelt saying, you know, that's true. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing menaces to society. You know, so my genius that he would have thought of that 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we can't count on the schools or the universities to teach morality to our children, and that's why it's up to mamas. I love the story. Let's turn the page to the nobility. It's on page 104 of the Cottage Meeting Manual. The story of the nobility of a boy. And I remember teaching my children this little story, but it's teaching stories like this and then having a discussion about honesty and virtue and integrity. That is how we teach. You know, obviously we try and live a life of morality, so we mirror it through our example, and then we teach stories of what it looks like. And the story, I would really recommend you reading this to your kids, or taking a picture and sending it to the kids that don't live at home, and then just saying, hey, what do you think of the story? I mean, it's really, it can be something as simple as that. So there was a young boy named David who lived in New York around the 1900s, and he was a little errand boy at a bank, and his mother and sister were sick, and they needed to be able to go to the country to recuperate and to heal and to get better, but they didn't have money to send them to the country because he just barely made enough money to care for their basic needs. And so he was sweeping under a table at the bank one day, and he found a big roll of cash. And he put it in his pocket. And he was going to go give it back to the bank. And then he thought, this would be the money that I could use to send my mom and sister to the country so they could heal and get better. So he went home with that wad of bills in his pocket, and he fingered it, and he checked on his mom when he got home. But an hour later, his little footsteps took him back to that bank. And he burst into the president's office and said, I found this while I was sweeping. And he dropped it on the table and fled out of the bank. And the next morning, when this boy David came back to the bank, the president found him, and he said, why did you bring those bills back? And because apparently the president knew the situation of this young boy and his home. And David said, and I love this, and this would be the teaching point to your children, grandchildren, as long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief. And wouldn't you know, a few days later, David went along with his mother and his sister to spend the whole summer in the countryside, a gift from the bank to show their deep appreciation for the nobility of this boy. And it's stories like this that we teach our children in little devotionals or around the dinner table or before they go to bed, or that spur on this discussion of what is morality. And so let's turn to the page, top of page 98 of the Cottage Meeting resource. On page 98 at the top, it says, virtue is not hereditary. It has to be earned and learned. Neither is virtue a permanent quality in human nature. It has to be cultivated continually. And what is the best and most effective way? Or not maybe the best, but what is an effective way to educate the rising generation? It's through telling these stories. So in this Raising a New Generation of Patriots, one of the resources we use each week, it's a small little book, but in chapter 4, it talks a lot about a mother's ability to teach through stories. And this is actually going to be lesson, I think it's number 7. We're going to dedicate a whole cottage meeting lesson number 7, to teaching through stories, because there's nothing like a story to go right to the heart of a person to help them understand. And so anyways, if we turn, Vivian, if we could have that next slide about that talks about the second principle in the 5,000-year leap. The second principle says, a free people cannot survive under a Republican Constitution unless they stay morally strong and virtuous. And if you just flip real quick to page 105, on page 105, there's a quote that says, our Constitution, by John Adams, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. What does that mean to you? If you had to explain that to someone, that the form of government, a republic, will not exist unless people remain morally strong and virtuous, how would you explain that, and why? Why do you think that is the case? And why do you think the founders knew that if people didn't stay morally strong and virtuous, that this form of government rooted in people's law couldn't be upheld through the centuries?
I guess I would say, because a lot of how our government was founded is on self-governance. So we as individuals have to have the moral integrity to self-govern and in our own life. And if we're raised to not do that, and we're becoming very dependent on others, dependent on government, then that structure will no longer work.
Exactly. The more we look to government to solve our problem and not to God as the deliverer, but to government, then we have need of more and more masters. That's what the founder said, to tell us to solve our problems, to look to Washington, D.C. to tell us, how we should raise our children, or how we should care for our bodies, or those kind of standards. And so, versus the people that are rooted in God and look first to God, get on their knees and ask him, I have a problem. Please help me here. How can I improve my situation, or improve my children's, or my neighbors, or my city or town situation? Exactly. So if we turn to page 50 on the 5,000-year leap, do we all have our 5,000-year leap? I'm just whipping you around all these resources today, Mamas. So on page 50, under the second principle, it talks about this notion of public virtue. All right, so we have this private virtue by which we operate within the four walls of our home and community, and then this public virtue. And it says under public virtue, page 50 in the 5,000-year leap, morality is identified with the Ten Commandments and obedience to the Creator's mandate for right conduct. But the early Americans identified public virtue as a very special quality of human maturity in character and service, closely akin to the Golden Rule. In a republic, each man must somehow be persuaded to submerge his personal wants into the greater good of the whole. The willingness of the individual to sacrifice his private interest for the good of the community. All right. So they understood that we not only had this private virtue that we needed to maintain, but we also had to be willing to do what would be best for our neighborhoods and for our communities and for our states. Now, I think this would be an interesting conversation to have with your children about wearing masks. Is it wearing masks today? Is it for the public good, or is it an infringement upon our rights? So sometimes you have to weigh what is truth here, what really is best for the public good. And so we won't have this conversation today, but I think it would be an interesting conversation to have with your children about this principle of public virtue in relation to a practical application of wearing our masks, which there seems to be so many versions of if that is best, or if that is an infringement on our rights. But I really like the story of Nathan Hale. Have you heard of him in regards to helping your children to understand this idea of public virtue? So let's just flip the page in our supplemental material to page, I believe it is
100.
Yeah, the 100, thank you. Page 100, Nathan Hale, One Life to Live. And I love this story. I taught this story to my children through the years. And even if you asked them today, they probably still wouldn't know who Nathan Hale is. That's the discouraging thing. Sometimes you teach your children these wonderful things and they forget. That is why mothers and grandmothers, we have to continually be repeating ourselves and reteaching these beautiful stories. And so this 21-year-old, he's real, young man from American history. At 21, he gave his life for this country. And this famous quote, I only regret, on page 100, that I only have but one life to lose for my country. These were the last words of the 21-year-old American patriot, Nathan Hale, before he was hung September 22nd, 1776. So he was just a young boy. He graduated from Yale University in 1773. He wanted to be a Christian minister, but he had a friend who was one of George Washington's chief intelligence officers. And this friend encouraged Nathan to do something great by joining the army and fighting alongside these men who desired freedom from Great Britain. And so he did. He joined the army, and the Continental Army. And George Washington at this time was desperate to know where the British were planning to invade Manhattan Island. So in September of 1776, he sought for a spy to penetrate the British lines along Long Island to get information. And the only person that volunteered was this young boy, Nathan Hale. And he had friends who tried to talk him out of it, but he did not. And so, wouldn't you know, after becoming the spy, within 2.5 weeks, Nathan Hales was captured by the Queen's Rangers, commanded by an American loyalist, General William Howe, and he was ordered to be hung, this 21-year-old young boy. And Nathan Hale wrote a letter to his mother and father, but the British destroyed it because they did not want them to know the firmness and faith of this young boy. And he even asked for a Bible while he was in jail before he was hung, and they refused that. So they marched him out the next day and hung him from an apple tree in Rutgers Orchard, which is now the middle of Chinatown in New York City, on the streets of East Broadway and Market in New York City. And just a few months after his death, in a journal, it was written of Nathan Hale, that he, in the gallows, he made a sensible and spirited speech telling them that they were shedding the blood of an innocent, and that if he had 10,000 lives, he would lay them all down if called to it, in defense of this injured, bleeding country. Now, this is an example, a beautiful, powerful example of public virtue. And it went on to say, fellow soldiers that knew Nathan said that when other soldiers were sick, he would always visit them, and he usually prayed for them. And interesting enough, the posterity of Nathan Hale went on to do great things. His nephew went on to become the governor of Massachusetts, and actually spoke at the dedication of the battlefield right before Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And also Nathan Hale's grandnephew, who was a well-known author, wrote, "We are God's children, you and I, and we have our duties. Thank God I came from men who are not afraid in battle." So you can see how the example of this man affected his forthcoming posterity, this one young boy. I love the little poem that Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about this. So nigh is grandeur to our dust, so near is God to man. When duty whispers low, thou must, the youth replies, I can. So how do we raise kids that show public virtue, that will do the hard thing for the better of the whole? For the last 30 years, I've had children in my home. And about 25 of those 30 years, I have taught from this book. It's called The Family's Virtue Guide. And in it includes like 100 virtues. And I take one virtue a week, and I would teach like the first one: assertiveness, caring, cleanliness, compassion, confidence, consideration, and it just goes down. And I would take one virtue each week, and I'd write that little virtue on a piece of paper and slap it on the refrigerator. And then while the kids were eating breakfast, I would read them, like, for instance, friendliness. I'd read them what friendliness was. And then it says there's like 4 pages that go along with each virtue. And it's entitled, Why Practice Friendliness? How do you practice friendliness? What does friendliness look like? So I'd read just a little bit each day, and we talk about friendliness. And during the school year, they get a new virtue every week. And, you know, you teach that virtues are really attributes of Christ, aren't they? That's what a virtue is. And so up until last year, I think I'm getting tired. 25 years I taught from this book about virtues, and then we take one little virtue each week. And my older kids, they would come home from college break and they would see the virtue up on their refrigerator and they would laugh and they go, "Are you still doing that, Mom?" But this is one way that I've taught virtue. It's a great book. I would recommend. Put it on your list of books to get and just see how you can teach virtues to your children. Okay, so let's turn back to page 98. We're just cruising through our little lesson here. I love this scripture. Do you see it in the middle of the page on Philippians? In the scripture, it says, "Whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue or praise, we think on these things." And so, once again, teaching out of the stories of the Bible is a beautiful way to teach virtues to our children, because God's law is infused with virtues, these attributes of Christ. Okay, so let's have the next slide, Vivian. The third principle of the 5,000-year leap says the best way to secure a virtuous and morally stable people is to elect virtuous leaders. So I really like in the book, The Promises of the Constitution, and we refer to it in our Cottage Meeting Manual by Pam Openshaw. Remember, it's like little vignettes on different parts of our history, so you can learn about the men of the Constitution, setting the rules, the miracles of Philadelphia in just about 3 paragraphs. So I love the vignettes here, optional reading you see in the middle of the page, vignettes 1:7, 7:7, 12:1, and 12:12. They're all so good. But if we turn to the vignette 12:12, which is on page 268 of Promises of the Constitution, if you don't have these books, I cannot recommend them enough. I've taught to my children, I've used this book a lot over the years. So if you turn to vignette 12:12 on page 268, Samuel Adams, there's a quote by Samuel Adams, who is known as the father of the American Revolution. And he talks about how virtue is connected to liberty. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued. But once they lose their virtue, they will be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invader. Yet, if virtue and knowledge are diffused among the people, they will never be enslaved. This will be their great security. And then it talks about how virtuous governments tell the truth. And it shows at the bottom of page 268, a system of totalitarian government disrespects morals, integrity, and individuals. As an example, it gives the Soviet leaders created worldwide havoc in the last century. Lenin, their early leader, a communist, urged his followers, be prepared to resort to every possible subterfuge, trick, a legal device calculated to conceal the truth. Then the actions of Stalin, his successor, demonstrated this philosophy well. Life under a political system that ignores morality is ugly. Often governments sometimes operate with force. They pass laws that make people do or not do what government wants without regard to the inalienable rights of citizens. This is where you can have your conversation about masks. Many otherwise rational people tolerate compulsion from government that they would not accept in their personal lives. And then at the bottom there, it says, Mark Levine, when virtue is gone, the republic is gone. So did Solomon. When the wicked rule, the people mourn. And it gives that reference in Proverbs 29 too. What do you think as you read what these founders understood about the link to virtue and the willingness to people to kind of give away their freedoms when government become less virtuous? What do you think about what we just read? Does it ring a little familiar about what we're seeing today in the world?
Yeah, I think people are willing to give up their liberty for what they feel is security. And not to get too far in it, but I mean, the masks, you know, are you willing to be told that you have to wear something? I'm not willing to do that. I don't feel it. The, I don't want the government telling me what I have to wear or what I have to do or what I need to buy, you know, starting with, you know, the Affordable Care Act. I'm being told I have to do this, I have to do that. And people are willing to give up their liberty because they feel, oh, we have to wear these masks to be safe. And it's like, no, you don't, because if you're willing to be, you know, if you're letting your government tell you these things, then you're willing to give up any liberty. You're willing to let them tell you anything that you need to do. And I just don't, I just can't get behind that. I want, you know, if it's right for me and my family to do that, then I'll make that choice. But I am not happy with my government leaders making me give up my liberty. I can't handle that. It's,
What do you think the link to virtuous leaders and a virtuous citizenry is?
well, for one thing, I don't think we have many virtuous leaders right now. I think they're all wanting to have power, and they're taking advantage of this situation to have power grabs, to do whatever they want to do in the name of public safety. You know, I mean, now they just enacted where I live yesterday, to even go into a store, you have to submit to a temperature check and you have to answer health questions. What about my privacy? It's like people, so I won't be doing all that. I'll be shopping on Amazon. I'm not going to go into a store and have them check my temperature or me have to give them personal answers. No, you're giving up all of your liberty for a false sense of security. I mean, who's going to go and say, oh, no, I haven't had a cop as they just had, you know, a copping attack in their car. Nobody's going to answer that. But it's like an infringement on your own rights. And I just will not give that up. I'm not giving up my liberty, you know, and I'm in every high risk category. But to me, it's my personal choice and my responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility to keep me safe. It's my responsibility to do that. And I'm not going to relinquish that to anybody to keep myself. I need to do what's right for me, what's right for my family. You know, and I love my neighbors and those things, but I love my liberty more than anything. And because without that, you have nothing.
Thank you. Yes. I'll never forget when President Clinton, the whole scandal with Monica Lewinsky broke. And I had teenagers at the time, and a whole new world opened up around oral sex. I'm like, isn't that wonderful that the President of the United States introduced something that became kind of like a subject of humor amongst young people? And that came from the top, a president. And you can see how morality is just slid as our leaders begin the slide. The whole, you know, nation slides when leaders are engaging in, you know, immoral and unvirtuous actions. And so I just remember thinking, thank you, President Clinton, you know, because he made something immoral kind of funny and the butt of all jokes and kind of the norm.
You know, Julian, you have Machiavelli, who basically says you have to be willing to give up your soul to be a leader. You're going to have to make horrible choices and do this and know that you're probably not going to end up in heaven with the Lord because of the sacrifices you're going to have to make to keep your people safe. And I mean, you know, they have to make tough choices, but they still need to do the right things.
Right.
You still have to do the right things.
You know, I love this idea as we study our founders. There's so many great examples of good, moral, virtuous men. And God works through these kind of individuals. And you can see how God worked through our founding mothers and fathers because they were moral and virtuous. You think of, it's interesting, in Principle 2, Thomas Jefferson refers to this idea of natural aristocracy. I can never say that. Aristocracy. Natural aristocracy versus artificial aristocracy. And if you go back to page 98 on the Cottage Meeting resource, it's kind of in the middle there. What is the difference, the question is asked, between a natural aristocracy and an artificial? If we could have that next slide, Vivian. Thomas Jefferson implied that natural aristocracy is where you get your best leaders, where they're like the best citizens that are kind of drafted into the service. They're asked to come and to serve. And they accept major roles in the government, much like Thomas Jefferson. He didn't really run for office the first time or even the second time. He was drafted by the people. They wanted him because of his valiancy and his virtuousness and the way in which he lived his life, versus this artificial notion of aristocracy that so much of the world, has accepted in history, this kind of being born into wealth and privilege, into office. Me and my husband are watching Downton Abbey right now. It took us like 5 years to catch on to Downton Abbey, but that's kind of an example to me of aristocracy. And even though I kind of like that family, the most noble of leaders come from this natural aristocracy where just good men and women rise and people desire to have them be the leaders. And that's really how the Electoral College was supposed to work, that good men and women were sought after by the electors and drafted into the service. And instead of, yesterday was elections, millions and millions of dollars being spent to promote yourself so you can, win office. That's not how the founders viewed where the best leaders would come from. So I love the vignette in Promises of the Constitution 3.6, vignette 3.6, and it's on page 50, talking about George Washington, the Revolutionary General. And I was so sad. My brother sent to me a little story today that George Washington University, which is in Washington, they're contemplating to keep the name George Washington as the university. And I thought of that quote by Karl Marx, the communist founder, that if you can get people to not know their heritage, they are easily persuaded. And this is what we're seeing now, that people don't even know the honorable man that George Washington is. And I love this little vignette. This would be such a good vignette, 3.6 on page 50, Promises of the Constitution, to read to your children, to shore them up about George Washington. He was known as the father of the country in his day. He was one of the wealthiest men in America at the time that he became the general of the Continental Army. And he gave up his life on Mount Vernon, where he longed to be. And for 8 miserable years, he fought in that war. And then another 8 years, he led the country as the president. And when he came home after 16 years to his neglected estate, much of it had deteriorated. His wealth was gone. He was in debt. And he was just struggling to meet his expenses. And he died 3 years after, he came home to Mount Vernon. But Thomas Jefferson, there's the most beautiful quote that Thomas Jefferson gives about Washington there. And it talks about how he was a military genius. And even though he was very private with his belief in God, he mentioned God over 100 times, mentioned God in the Bible over 100 times in correspondences he wrote throughout his life. And I love, that story of him being bulletproof, George Washington, in the story, The Miracles of America, how during the French-American Wars, the Indians kept trying to shoot at him, and he would never go down. And years later, he met with the local Indian council, and they said that when they saw him in action all those years before, that there was a prophecy that went out amongst the Indian people that the Great Spirit protected that man and guided his destiny, and that he would someday become the chief of nations. And people yet unborn would hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. And so, you know, there's so many beautiful books on George Washington, but I don't think our young people know and understand these stories anymore. They're losing the heritage of this man, thinking that he might not really be qualified to have anything named after him, you know. And so anyways, it's up to us children to teach about these honorable men and women. So lastly, there's that wonderful scripture at the bottom of the page on 98 of our Cottage Meeting Manual, talks about a virtuous woman, how her price is far above rubies, and how God knew the impact of a virtuous woman, what a virtuous mother and grandmother could have in her home and in her family and her community and in the world, really. And I love this last little story before we close out our lesson today on Benjamin Franklin and his impact as a virtuous man. Remember, Benjamin Franklin, historians, modern day historians have done a number on Ben Franklin's reputation and his morality. But if you get that book, The Real Benjamin Franklin, he was known as the Golden Quaker because he was such a man of integrity and virtue and morality. But there's this story on page 106 of the Cottage Meeting Manual entitled Reflecting the Light of Virtue. This was before street lightings existed at the time of Benjamin Franklin. He sat one evening by his window in his home, and he heard a man stumble outside of his window because of the uneven cobblestones in Philadelphia. And obviously the man had hurt himself because there wasn't any lighting in front of Benjamin Franklin's home. There wasn't any lighting in front of anyone's home at that time. And so Benjamin Franklin thought about that. He said, really, I'm to blame for this man falling because there wasn't a light in my window that could have shone out on the street and prevented this misfortune. So the next morning he goes, Benjamin Franklin, to a lantern maker's shop, and he said, I want a huge lantern. And when he described the kind of lantern he wanted, the shopkeeper laughed and he said, there's not room big enough in all of Philadelphia for that kind of lantern. But nevertheless, he got the biggest lantern that the shop had, and they prepared the rack. He said, I want you to prepare the rack outside of my door and hang it there, and I will be responsible each night for lighting that lamp, Benjamin Franklin said. And so sure enough, they did that, and he got that light, and every night there was this big light that would burn outside of Benjamin Franklin's home, the only light on the street. And as people would pass by at night, they'd look at that and they said, what an idea. And then someone else said, I'm going to do the same thing. Why stumble over these cobbles when a little light over each man's door makes the dark way plain? Why didn't someone else think about this? And then they said, trust old Ben to think of a scheme like this to get the citizens of this town busy on the street light. Any other person would have talked and argued, but old Ben, well, he just went ahead and hung up a light. And I love these parting thoughts for a lesson today. As confusion and contention increases in our nation and world, Moms for America offers a simple solution. Don't underestimate the power and influence that one home reflecting the light of virtue can have on an increasingly dark world. And oftentimes it is mother that will be the means of doing that right thing in that home or in that community or neighborhood. Something as simple as having the courage to wave your flag, what that says to your children, what that says to your neighbors. The nice thing about these virtual cottage meetings is it gives women an idea of what it looks like to actually lead and have a discussion of what a cottage meeting is, because that can be intimidating to women. So we're like, oh no, I have to start a group and I have to be the teacher. So it's just a good model that women can hopefully watch and get some ideas and gain some confidence and courage that maybe I can lead a cottage meeting. And once you do that, you're off to the races. Your life will never be the same. You'll never not want to meet together with women, like-minded women, and because you really see how it shores you up and shores you up as a mother and impacts your home, your marriage, your neighborhood. So anyways, Well, so you know it's the 4th of July on Saturday. Our country's going to be 244 years old. And this next lesson that we're going to have next week, The Power of Patriotism, has some great stories and quotes and ideas that will really pertain to, this holiday we're heading into. So I'd really recommend scanning some of the material, and maybe on the 4th of July or 4th of July barbecue. I know everything is scaled down. The big 4th of July celebration that we have in Washington, D.C. every year is canceled. The 4th of July celebration in Colonial Williamsburg that we are also close to is canceled. So we're just going to have our own celebration. So I would really recommend going through this manual and pulling out a little story or a little quote and reading it and just bearing your little witness and testimony of it at the barbecue. Why not? You have a captive audience, even if it's just your children and husband. But use this as a great resource, especially on the 4th of July. Read them a little story about Nathan Hale and what it means to make the right decision for the greater good of this nation. And have this resource, Cottage Meeting Manual, bless your life that day on the 4th of July. So anyways, okay, I think we're ready to sign off unless anyone else has anything else to say. Thank you so much, ladies. Have a great 4th.
See you.